Well, thank you everybody for attending today. We're going to have a conversation about municipal finance, municipal bonds and taxing authority, and petrochemicals and plastics in Texas and Louisiana. Yes, a bit of a detailed topic, but the point of this is, are there opportunities for industry to adjust its capital stack, work with communities, and improve and decrease their plastics footprint globally? We have four panelists today, and I'll introduce them shortly. We're very fortunate to have them on board. Sheila, you can do the next slide, please. Planet Tracker is a nonprofit financial think tank. We work to align capital markets with planetary limits. Planet Tracker focuses on enabling the investor community to understand ecological limits so investors can align capital within those planetary boundaries. The plastics program, of which I'm the head of, aims to stem the flow of environmentally damaging plastics and related products that are creating global waste and health issues. Next slide, please. We're very excited with four distinguished speakers today. Jane Patton, who's a campaign manager for plastics and petrochemicals at SEAL, and she's also a resident of New Orleans with a lifelong commitment to supporting sustainable development for the communities of the Gulf Coast. Dr. Alice Ma is a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick and a world-recognized leader in the environmental justice analytics around the petrochemical industry. She's published many award-winning books, and I highly recommend them. Tom Sanzillo, he's the director of financial analysis at IEEFA. Tom has had a distinguished career in fixed income for over 30 years and is considered a thought leader in this space on how to transition industry towards a low carbon future while addressing environmental justice risks. And Brendan Sheehan is a vice president and senior credit officer focusing on environmental social governance risks and opportunities for Moody's. So we're going to be talking about five key ideas. They're a bit complex, and if it doesn't make sense, that's on me to explain it better. So the first one is the plastics production corridor. The next one is Texas Chapter 313, which is a Texas tax on property that has recently been rescinded that was used by the petrochemical industry to avoid paying taxes on their property. And those property taxes, if they had paid them, would have funded schools and climate change mitigation, such as levees and other structures. Very similar, Louisiana's industrial tax exemption program, currently ongoing. It's a way for, it's an incentive structure that's in place to encourage industrial development within Louisiana. And it does that by decreasing the property taxes paid by large Fortune 500 companies. If those companies do pay those taxes, one can suggest that funding would go to climate change mitigation and schools, which are the direct recipient in the United States of property tax funding, or indirect, depending on how we analyze it. What happens is that in Louisiana in particular, we have an area called Cancer Alley, and I'll explain the petrochemical history. The history of the petrochemical industry along Cancer Alley. You'll see some interesting maps showing the impact and the extent of the build out of the petrochemicals by chemicals in that region. Finally, we'll talk about the role of municipal bonds and how this overlaps like an umbrella and the impact this may or may not have on investors, with some key suggestions that investors and corporations may want to consider. Next slide, please. Plastics, where are we today? We're at the first node. First of all, we need to understand that plastics production is a supply chain. At the very beginning, you have petrochemical companies, as you can see here, Dow, ExxonMobil, and pure play plastics producers like Indorama. Then you have plastics containers and packaging companies. The top 20 in the world are listed here. This is for publicly traded only. That's like Aptar, Topon, Sealed Air, many names you may not have heard of. These companies sell plastic packaging to the brands that we're familiar with, Kraft Heinz, Coca-Cola, and others. Today, we're going to be focusing on the first node, the petrochemical clusters and corridors. Next slide, please. Now, plastic production in the United States is focused in one key area, with some exceptions, of course. That area is called plastic production corridor, right? You can see that we're in the highlighted sort of oval at the middle of the screen. Now, how do we calculate that? We use data from Bloomberg and Nexent ECA, which is chemicals data provider. We looked at 37 different commodity chemicals across 3 different supply chain nodes: basic chemicals, intermediates, and plastic resins, because plastics are produced from upstream chemical engineering using chemical engineering processes. And with that, we looked at 9 different plastic resins: ABS, which is the hard plastic around a phone, for example; EPS, which is like expanded polystyrene and polystyrene; high density polyethylene; low density polyethylene; linear low density polyethylene. Think of packaging and wrap. PET, which in this case we're focusing only on bottle grade PET, so plastic bottles; polyvinyl chloride. That, for example, is going to be like the plastic you'd find in window frames and doors; and polypropylene. So 12% of the capacity in the United States for these key chemicals are right here in the plastic production corridor, and that's 84 production lines. Next slide, please. Now, what happens is that if we dig a little bit deeper, it's important to really dig a little bit deeper, we find out that these facilities are only in 21 counties in the plastics production corridor. Yes, there are plastic production facilities in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and other states, of course, but we're just going to focus on these 2 regions today. As you can see, you have the list of the parishes, which are counties in Louisiana on the left, and the counties in Texas, and you can see them across the plastic production corridor. Next slide, please. This is also the key corridor that gets hit by tropical depressions, storms, and in the absolute worst case scenario, hurricanes, like Hurricane Ida recently did. Since 1990, there have been over 60 different tropical storms, depressions, and hurricanes that have hit the region. That's what the black squiggly line is here. It looks like spaghetti. If I tried to name all the storms, you wouldn't be able to see the slide. Already, it's not a very pretty slide with too much squiggly lines, of course. But also, this is the same region that then suffers from sea level rise, which is a chronic risk, and storm surge, which is an acute risk. You can see the colored gradations as we go from like a dark blue to a light blue, showing the sea level rise risk in the region, and the same thing for storm surge. And you can see that much of these risks overlap with these production facilities. Next slide, please. Stay there, please. And so you can see here, this is exactly where Hurricane Ida hit. In fact, one of our colleagues who presented last week at our conference that had over about 750 different registered attendees, Ms. Sharon Levine, she's a global leader on plastics reduction and the decrease of negative impacts from the industry in her community in St. James Parish. Her house was destroyed by Hurricane Ida. So these risks, while they may appear on a map, are impacting us. Thank you. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get a little bit technical, but we're going to stay at hopefully a high enough level that it makes sense. There's a couple of different funding mechanisms here we're going to just briefly talk about. Today's conversation is a qualitative conversation about what type of strategies should investors, municipal bond fund managers, and companies take. First of all, is Chapter 313. Chapter 313 is a recently discontinued property tax tool that was used by many institutions along the Gulf Coast, where if I went to you and said, you're at that municipality, you're at that county, and I said, can I have a tax break to build out a petrochemical facility? You might give me the tax break, but if I had paid my taxes, where would those taxes have gone? And a significant portion of those taxes would have gone to schools, because in the United States, not on a 100% basis, but a significant portion of property taxes, both individual property taxes, but also property taxes of the industrial sector, are used to fund schools. That's how we fund schools. So if if I'm in a petrochemical company and pay less taxes, that's less taxes for schools. That's the theory. In practice, it's often slightly different. Next slide, please. So then we look at Louisiana and Cancer Alley. Now, Cancer Alley, unfortunately, is the name of this region in Louisiana, which starts from New Orleans, goes all the way up to Baton Rouge, because there's a much higher percentage of cancer among those communities than the baseline rate in the United States. In some communities, the cancer rate is twice, 2 times, 5 times, 10 times, and even 50 times higher than the baseline rate in the United States. It's very difficult to have an absolute line from a petrochemical facility to cancer I might have. Yet if I'm surrounded by ambient pollution and I get cancer, that's what's happening. As you can see here, you can see all the different chemicals that are produced in the region. Emulsifiers, nitrogen, neoprene rubber, polypropylene. Read the screen. It's remarkable. This is the petrochemical production area of the United States, and it's also the area where you have significant healthcare risks. Dr. Ma will talk about global trends and global issues around this during the chat part of this conversation today. Next slide, please. As you can see here are the facilities in black. And you can see where these facilities, over 200 of them, emit more toxic chemicals than they exceed regulatory levels on toxic chemical emissions. And because they exceed those regulatory levels, they are then required to report to the United States Environmental Protection Agency how they've exceeded those regulatory levels and with which chemicals and quantities and location. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the same region that's Cancer Alley is the same region that has that gets significant industrial tax exemptions for the petrochemical industry itself. So you can see here, the darker the red color, the more the industrial tax exemptions that have been in place. In Cow County, and the counties here along the Mississippi River, starting with West Baton Rouge down to Jefferson and Plaquemine, are also the leading counties with cancer, and they're part of Cancer Alley. I mean, Cow is not technically part of it, but it also has significant cancer risk. So there's an overlay there on industrial tax exemptions, which is a decrease in property taxes that these petrochemical companies pay, that could instead be used to fund schools, as you can read in the slide here, versus healthcare risks. I mean, just look at the 11 plastic production corridor parishes here in 2018. They had over $666 million in lost tax revenue to support the petrochemical industry, which ended up being almost $300 million in lost school funding. This is some of the poorest regions in the United States, some of the most disadvantaged communities. These are communities that historically, sadly, are often with many members of the community from this, what would have been slave plantations many years ago. That's where their ancestors are from. And they themselves are losing their their school funding because it's going to the petrochemical industry. That's a story that they share. Next slide, please. So let's look at one single parish or county. This county is called St. James Parish. And has one very large facility that's been proposed by Formosa Plastic, a Taiwanese publicly traded company. They want to build about a $10 billion plastics production facility with about 10 to 12 different integrated chemical facilities, as you can read up here in the slide. They're thinking that'll end up with 1,200 new jobs. And according to their forecasts, they're asking for tax relief on an annual basis of $125,000 per new permanent job. That's their analysis that's been published by the state of Louisiana. I need to be very careful in what I'm saying because it does not include construction jobs. And those are temporary jobs. Now, you might say, well, that's you're not including construction jobs. I'm like, yeah, that's a very good critique of the story that I'm telling. But the reason why I'm not including construction jobs is many times construction jobs are short-term employees that come from out of state or out of the region to perform a specific task and then leave. They're not often people who live in the region. So that's why we make that distinction here. Construction jobs would be another 5,000 jobs. And if those are included in this analysis, it would be about $25,000 in tax relief per job. Now, the ad valorem taxes that Formosa Plastic has asked for, that were granted to Formosa Plastic by the municipal authority, were $150 million. As you can see here, that's the taxes that they're scheduled to not pay. Okay. Now, fortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers of the United States has ordered a full environmental review of this controversial plant, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Tom Sansilla, who's on the call, has a lot of experience about this circumstance. Will be able to explain it a little bit better than me, certainly. Next slide, please. No, go back, please. Now, it's important for us to understand who Miss Sharon Levine is. Miss Sharon Levine is a local school teacher who worked with disadvantaged students. And she saw many people in her community pass away from cancer, unfortunately, in the Cancer Alley area. And she started leading a protest against this Formosa Plastics. And so this is the power of what one individual has to possibly impact and support change in a community. And she was awarded the Golden Environmental Prize. She may be attending today. I'm not sure if she is, but I know members of her community are, and we very much support the work she does and their community at Rise St. James do. Next slide, please. So these are some questions we need to ask. Let's go up the river to Baton Rouge. Now, ExxonMobil, one of the largest companies in the world, very successful engineering firm and oil and gas firm, who's obviously had about a 25-year history of needing to figure out what it wants to do about GHG emissions. It's still not quite there. But it's a lot of really talented people too. These are really smart engineers. They've issued 3 municipal bonds. These are the QSIPs, which is the alphanumeric code for those bonds. It's $523 million. And those 3 municipal bonds, of which they're the ultimate obligor, they're the ultimate that they have to pay. So that's what that means. Is through the East Baton Rouge Parish Industrial Revenue Facility. Now, that's a facility that these bonds are used to fund. That's off of Exxon's webpage. So that's their picture. Now, what's happened is that this specific facility produces 17% of total U.S. capacity for low-density polyethylene, and 6% of total U.S. capacity for polypropylene. This one facility right here, and those bonds. This one facility and those bonds. So in 2019, ExxonMobil then went to East Baton Rouge, said, "Can we have a $3 million tax break?" They wanted to decrease their their property tax liability by $3 million. And the school board voted 5-4 no. So this is a key decision in the U.S. on mitigating plastic pollution, because the school did not want to give ExxonMobil did not want to decrease the school budget by $3 million. The school board there in Baton Rouge runs a very successful education program. They're recognized in the United States. And they stood up to the big oil to try to make a difference and say, we don't want to create more plastic pollution, and we're not going to let you decrease our property taxes because we need that money for our students. Next slide, please. So finally, we need to ask some big picture questions. These are questions I don't have the answer to. Maybe you do, and maybe we can work together to figure them out collectively as a community. What type of policy should municipal bond fund managers have? I mean, should municipal bond fund managers who have these bonds in their portfolio could look at the municipal bonds that have been issued by the petrochemical companies and perform extra screening on them? In the United States, it's 110 bonds. No, it's $32 billion. It's a lot of money. I mean, I'm sorry, it's not 30. It's less than it's less than that. Sorry about that. I misspoke. But still a lot of money. Can a municipal bond fund manager support mitigating the plastics crisis by screening the petrochemical names in their portfolio to see if those companies are paying the taxes they should pay, as opposed to using industrial revenue industrial tax exemption programs? Can the petrochemical and plastics companies decide to not use industrial tax exemption programs? Can they instead decide to pay their full taxes, carry their fair share, not make these disadvantaged and struggling communities have the extra burden of a decrease in school funding? Maybe some of these large companies can choose to no longer issue municipal bonds. So when you look at the overall of those 21 different counties, right, and you add up all the bonds, there's almost 5,000 municipal bonds. And the value is almost $33 billion. So if you're an investor, you probably have these bonds in your portfolio at the county level. The bonds have been issued by the municipalities. It might be worth it to take a quick look and screen your portfolios for these counties to see what you can do to change and decrease plastic waste. Just look at that ExxonMobil. Go back to the previous slide, please. Just go back to look at that image. That's the plastics production facility in East Baton Rouge. Those are some of the bonds that are used to finance facility. Are they in your portfolio? So with that, thank you very much. And we'll go back to, we'll introduce the speakers and do some brief question and answer. So Brendan, over to you. You're with Moody's, a global credit rating agency that is a very, very good reputation. I'm just curious what you're thinking about ESG and municipal bonds and what type of global trends you're seeing in the space, please.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Gabriel, and others. I'm excited to be here. You know, ESG in general has always been a very tricky thing to think about when it comes to the fixed income markets, right? But it's particularly so in the municipal space. Yeah, as with other fixed income classes, ESG factors have kind of always been incorporated into bond valuations to some extent. But there's definitely been, we have seen over the last 3 or 4 years, a significant increase in momentum around, particularly coming from investors around municipal bonds, to incorporate more environmental and social factors systematically throughout their portfolios. One of the big challenges for that, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, is disclosure and transparency. Right? It hasn't always been easy for major fund managers. You had a number of them on the list, a number of their names up on that list earlier, to really understand exactly what the source of some of those municipal bonds are, what the funds are being used for. And that's one of the interesting changes that we've seen. There's been a huge increase in demand from the fund manager community, which ultimately has been driven by the individual citizen, right? Who's trying to hold their fund managers accountable for, where is my 401k money going? Where's my investment money going? So it really has been driven more from a grassroots development than anything else. But nonetheless, the fund managers are now demanding a lot more information from municipal issuers around what these funds are actually being used for. What are the real ESG credentials of these bonds? And we've seen a couple of significant lawsuits actually from the SEC against fund managers that have been claiming to have more ESG credentials than they really do. And that's and I won't get into that because that's a 1-hour conversation in and of itself, but it does highlight the pressure that is coming from all quarters, from individual investors, from regulators, from government bodies on the fund management industry to gain transparency. Now, what that is going to do is to drive transparency out of a lot of the municipalities themselves. Many of the munis have either failed to see the value in increased transparency or actually view it as a direct burden around providing more information. We see it more as a benefit. As a rating agency and as an analytical firm at its core, the more information we have to analyze risk, the better we think that is, right? So we are definitely in favor of some of the shifting priorities at federal and state level around ESG disclosure. Now, just to get into some of the numbers, Moody's itself has been investing very heavily in its ESG practice over the last few years. We've bought a number of significant data providers. We've built a team internally, and we're doing a lot more review and analysis on some of these factors than we have in the past. We've always thought about them, right? It's impossible to do a bond rating without thinking about what's some money being used for, what are the supply chain challenges, what are the impacts on the community, are they going to be able to sustain this activity long term? Those things have always been done, but we've also been guilty of not always being transparent around how we actually analyze those risks and how much those risks actually impact the credit rating, right? How actually impact the probability of default or the loss given default for both the corporations and the munis themselves. The biggest challenge when it comes to munis, however, is they have unlike corporates, there's a very diverse range of funding and expenditure challenges that munis have, right? Municipalities, depending on where they are, have responsibility for schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure, utilities, all sorts of projects that the corporate entities don't necessarily have. Their fundraising and capital investment streams are somewhat cleaner, as it were, right? To no pun intended around the use of the word, but so one of the challenges around muni funding and doing credit analysis of municipalities and regional and local governments is that they do have multiple ways to raise money. Taxation, which you've touched on, issuance of bonds, and many other vehicles around them. And nearly everything that a municipal government does in some way, shape, or form is E&S related, right? The things that they're spending money on are all to do with social and environmental factors. What we have seen, though, is a significant increase in the amount of money that's being raised and issued that is being specifically identified or earmarked for ESG spending, right? What we call green, social, or sustainable funding, GSS funding. Another acronym that we can throw into the alphabet soup of acronyms that go around in this space, right? And just to give you a couple of numbers, this is focused on the municipalities that we rate in the United States, right? We don't rate all the municipalities, we rate most of them, and US only. So total GSS bond and loan issuance in 2020, which is obviously the most recent complete year that we have, from US municipalities was $2.51 billion of bonds that were specifically targeted for use of funds that were either environmental or social in nature. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, and it's only 4.2% of the overall municipal bond issuance that happened in the United States in 2020. But when you look at that compared to 2019, it's a huge jump. In 2019, it was 10.9 billion. So you've gone from 10.9 billion to 21.5 in the space of a year. And that has gone from representing 2.4% of municipal fundraising and spending to 4.2%. Already in 2020, we're coming up against those numbers, and we're only looking at data through to August. Sorry, in 2021. So by the time we get to the end of this year, we will far eclipse that level. Now, that's important because those funds, those bond issuances or loan issuances are very strictly monitored around use of proceeds. Right? This is not like a general obligation bond that a lot of cities and regional and local governments issue, where they raise $1 billion and they can spend it on more or less whatever they want, right? These are bonds and loans that are being raised that have a very explicit use of proceeds. And there's a number of second-party assessment services out there. Moody's does this ourselves, but there's a number of other players that will very closely monitor whether those funds are actually being used for what they say they're going to be used for, whether it's infrastructure development, green energy, building of levees, social funding. Now, the other interesting part of it, and I'll stop because I know we don't have a huge amount of time, is that the single biggest increase in that space, which has historically been focused on green bonds, I think everyone's familiar with that term, has been social. Social went from $800 million of bond and loan issuance in 2019 to, I'll write this down, make sure I get it right, to 5.1 billion in 2020. It's a huge step up of socially focused bond issuance. And that's mostly focused on things like healthcare and public housing are the two primary recipients of that sort of funding, but it also does go into transportation and education. Transportation is very important, certainly in the larger cities where, for the most part, less affluent people tend to live on the outskirts of the cities, and they've been restricted from getting access to good jobs in the center of town because they can't get there, right? Yeah. There's also been an increase in spending around childcare facilities and those sorts of things. So there definitely has been a very significant increase in use of proceeds funds, which is what we call them at Moody's. It's a sort of an internal lingo. But what that is driving is a greater appetite for this sort of bond issuance and for very explicit use of proceeds. And it's also driving enhanced transparency. A lot of what happens in the finance world comes from transparency, right? That's been true of most of the ESG initiatives I've seen over the last 20 years. So we're definitely seeing a growth in ESG issuance. We're seeing a huge growth in demand from the fund managers. We're seeing a lot of regulatory oversight of it. And a much greater awareness around the role of corporations in their societies and the impacts that they have on residents of the municipalities and the long-term effects that can have that have probably been somewhat undervalued or overly discounted up to this point in time. So definitely positive changes. The other interesting thing about munis is that historically the focus on ESG has been less for them than it has been for corporates and others, largely because of the preferential tax treatment that that sort of issuance has, so that purchasers of municipality bonds have been less interested in some of the ESG characteristics because they get a guaranteed tax protection in their return, and there's often other benefits involved in owning municipal bonds. So people haven't been as concerned about what are the underlying actual behaviors going on, right? Which has, and that is not necessarily the case in corporates. So that is definitely starting to change.
Well, this is really interesting. I'm thinking, so, Alice, you're listening to this as an academic and a leading researcher, and I'm sorry about my Outlook. Oh my gosh, stop Outlook. I hope you're not hearing that ping.
No, we're not.
Welcome to Zoom world. So Alice, as a leading researcher around, the petrochemical industry and toxic chemical releases globally, do you see more interest in the petrochemical industry in addressing toxic chemical releases? What type of stories are you seeing of which Cancer Alley is only one example of? Are there other examples around the world that you can think of that you want us to highlight today?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel to share my sociological perspectives on the petrochemical industry. Yeah, I mean, I've been researching with an interdisciplinary team, the global petrochemical industry, including corporations, but also fence line communities, people who live close to petrochemical sites, looking at cases around the world, including in the US and Cancer Alley, in China and in Europe. And yeah, definitely over the past few years in leading industry conferences that I've been attending, I've seen this massive spike in ESG interest prompted by the plastics crisis and particularly the climate emergency. And it has been encouraging actually to see this movement towards divestment and the power that finance can have to shape policies. But I think my intervention here is going to be just three main points and hoping to sort of push a little bit in terms of how you can actually even calculate the risks or costs of environmental harm. So while I would encourage the expansion of thinking not just about ESG in terms of the climate crisis or in terms of very specific kinds of weighings of different risks, to think of it in a wider way, and to think actually to borrow Moody's idea of this idea that the climate crisis is a multiplier of risk, a risk multiplier. I think actually toxicity is a major multiplier of risk, as we've seen in your presentation, Gabrielle, about the effects of extreme weather events, for example. Just point number one is around environmental justice. I'm not sure how familiar everyone in attendance is with this idea, but it's basically the idea that everyone has the right to a healthy environment, and also pointing to the fact that there's disproportionate burdens of toxic exposures and environmental injustice on ethnic minority, working class, and low-income people. And this isn't just the case in the United States, although the United States is where this movement began, but it's all around the world, as our research has shown. And it's linked to very structural problems of systemic racism. And I think it's important actually maybe for a US audience, or people who come from Louisiana or Texas, who are familiar probably with Cancer Alley, to know how significant this place is actually for the global environmental justice movement, for as in some ways an infamous example with the long-standing struggles, the fact that it began in the 1980s and there's still more and more pollution that keeps enduring over these times. So despite coining the term Cancer Alley in the 80s to try to bring attention to these issues, these systemic problems have continued. And I think it is encouraging that the United Nations has called this a human rights crisis or a violation most recently this year, and brought more international attention to it. And yeah, you can see if you look, there's other cancer alleys, places that are called Cancer Alley or Cancer Valley, cancer villages in
Can you
China,
name some of those for our audience members? Who can you name some of the other locations, please?
Well, I mean, Corpus Christi in Texas, for example, the Refinery Row, you can see, I mean, in China alone, there's 450 villages. They're actually mostly in rural areas that they've been named, and they've been officially recognized by the Chinese government. I mean, there's also been, special protests around particular cities in China, like Xiamen as a kind of a famous example. And most recently, even in Europe, Fosse-sur-Mer, there was a big New York Times article a couple of years ago about how in this place where there was always this understanding that jobs are great and Europe is more sensible with regard to regulations, perhaps, they also found 2 times the cancer rates and did a huge health study, and there's major protests there as well. Those are just some examples, but many actually don't have movements, but report many problems as well, not to mention all the accidents. But just to bring this to 2 further points, which I'll say quite quickly because I want to open it out, the discussion. The second point is related, which is in terms of how the industry sees this, or how these might pose bigger threats, I suppose, in terms of ESG, if you want to think of it in that way, problems, are that these issues are starting to definitely intersect. So toxic pollution, the climate crisis, plastic waste, systemic racism. There are multiscalar, basically, forces, if you like, or activists, NGOs, governments, international agencies, regulators, all starting to have conversations with each other. Just this week, there was the UN expert who was talking about hazardous waste and how the petrochemical and plastics industries have been denying the health impacts for decades, which is well known in the literature, but maybe not as well known more broadly. So I think that there is rising momentum, and it's somewhere to watch in terms of, I guess, reputational risk and those kinds of things. But then just to conclude with the last point, as a sociologist, I come from a different perspective, which is that ultimately, I think that these are incalculable risks, and that there can be a danger in framing everything in terms of financial value or bringing it back to economic cost. And I think that actually, to quote an economist, Mariana Mazzucato, who's talked about the difference between value creators and value destroyers in the economy, and how we've collectively bought into a myth of value creation being entrepreneurs and risk-taking and this kind of cavalier type of capital, but actually you need to think about, are these companies creating value? And if they're not, if actually they're destroying health and destroying environment, and those costs economically as well as socially are going to be, incalculable in terms of actually dealing with them in the long term, but also even in the short term, then you need to rethink, what do you actually mean when you're talking about value? And I think that is something that investors and companies should be thinking about.
Thank you very much, Alice. That's a very profound point. It's apropos and for today's. Wonderful. Jane, you live in Louisiana. You've been there for a long time. How does this, give us 5 minutes or 8 minutes about how this resonates for you, and then let's go to Tom to start the conversation and close things up.
Sure. I like, Gabrielle, that you included a picture of the Exxon refinery in Baton Rouge in your presentation. I actually grew up not very far from that refinery, and y'all may or may not have heard that there was a hurricane that came through here just a few weeks ago. And I had to evacuate to my family home from my house because we didn't have power and we had some water inside. And so I spent a week in Baton Rouge with my dad and had to drive past the Exxon refinery a couple times. And every single stack in that picture was flaring at maximum capacity for days on end after the hurricane. That was true of the Exxon refinery. That was true of the Norco refinery in South Louisiana. That was true of the Danka plant. That was true of every refinery that had a flare stack that I passed. They were flaring, and it was not clean flaring. It was dirty flaring.
What is flaring? Not everybody will know what that means. Sorry.
Flaring is when petrochemical and other refinery facilities burn off the excess gas or feedstock that they have that they are unable to process or use. And a lot of these facilities didn't have power, which means they weren't able to run their refining and cracking capacity after the storm, which means they basically had to burn it off because there's no way to safely store it because there's combustion issues, there's loss issues and space issues.
So when you burn something, it takes the dangerous chemicals and puts them in the air. It doesn't destroy a lot of the dangerous chemicals. No, that's what we think. Right. Especially if you're seeing what's a dirty burn, especially if you're seeing black smoke come out of a flare stack. And I see that our friend Yvette is on the line here, and they definitely know firsthand the way this looks in Houston, the way this looks in Corpus Christi, the way this looks in the industrial corridor that Gabrielle showed earlier. So when I think about Alice's question, how are we thinking about value and how are we creating value? I made a joke at the panelists before we got on the line. I had to Google what a municipal bond was when Gabrielle asked me to be on this panel. I am not a bond expert. I'm going to be totally honest with y'all. But what I do understand is the things that local communities need and the things that we are not getting from the corporations that are building in our backyards, that are flaring toxic chemicals into the air, and that are denying the science over and over and over again. They're obfuscating the science, they're denying the results, and telling us that we are not sick when we can see what is in front of our faces, when we know what our families are experiencing. And I'm not even experiencing it as firsthand as some of the other folks in Louisiana and Texas and China and other places are. So I have the extremely painful luxury of having this conversation with you from a little bit of a distance, but it's still something that is just extremely acute.
I wanted to pull out this idea, I think, Brendan, you had said something a minute ago about the things that municipalities spend money on is most of it is social and environmental funding. And those are pretty broad categories for very real things. And in the United States, at the very least, let's say schools, right? My little boy just turned 5. He just started kindergarten. He's back in his school building as of yesterday, after weeks away from COVID and the storm. I cannot tell you how happy my husband and I are to have him back in the school building. But schools in the United States are predominantly funded through local property taxes. 40% of school funding, at minimum, comes from local property taxes. The same companies that we were talking about, and Gabrielle showed this slide earlier, are evading millions of dollars a year in local property taxes, which is directly cutting into funding for schools. It's directly cutting into funding for health and hospitals. When the people who live right next to the Exxon plant in Baton Rouge have to breathe in that dirty smoke, have to live in their houses in 100-degree heat with no air conditioning while breathing in that smoke, which is exactly the condition that people I know found themselves in the last few weeks. When they seek care at a hospital, we have lost 5 of the 9 public hospitals, publicly owned hospitals in Louisiana since 2005. There are 4 publicly owned hospitals in the state of Louisiana that serve 4.6 million people. We have lost our healthcare funding at the same time that we are losing our health. We have lost our school funding at the same time that we are talking about crises in education and crises in childhood development. And at that same time, we are seeing the tax breaks for these corporations go up. We are seeing the amount of money that corporations are putting toward local funding go down compared to what already strapped families are putting to local funding. So when we're having this conversation about municipal bonds and municipal finance and safety and value, the value that is created for me is for my little boy to be able to grow up in a good school, where all of the kids in our neighborhood go to a good school, where all the kids in every neighborhood go to a good school, and the air they breathe is clean. And we are all contributing what needs to be contributed to making that happen. And especially the corporations that are making millions of dollars off of destroying the environment near where I live, billions of dollars, especially seeing them contribute to this. And that is not what we are experiencing right now. So as we have this conversation about funding and about municipal bonds and about what is value, we have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we all have to eat, and our kids have to be educated, and we have to be healthy. And we have to put those needs and funding those needs first. And I think that's very important that we keep having that conversation as we move forward. And with that, I will hand it back to Gabrielle.
Thank you, Jane. Wow, that's just perfect, spot on. Absolutely. What's the value? What's our 21st century value of wealth mean? To be inclusive, to care and coordinate, to take care of our planet within our planetary boundaries. You know, I don't have much to add on that. Tom, over to you. Take us home.
Thanks for having me. My organization is involved in economics and finance and energy all over the world, and I'm a former comptroller in New York State and have a lot of experience with the bond markets. But we've been looking at the plastic sector in my current organization, and I'll be very quick. But it's the question that I think one of the questions that we're asking here is: are these facilities that the companies are proposing, are they good partnership risks for local governments? You know, it's where you're looking here. And so should we invest, the people, I guess the people's money, should they invest along with the companies to have them, host them in our communities? and so when I look at the industry, the plastics industry right now, if you were to ask them how they're doing, I think the term would be fantastic. Actually, that's one of the terms. From a profit point of view, coming out of the pandemic, they've been doing quite well. And that means that they have resources available to invest, and how those resources are going to be invested is a real question. Is it going to be in the kind of facilities that are create the toxic problems and all that we've been talking about, or are there ways to have that money invested positively? And that is a real question, and it comes down to a community looking at the companies and saying, well, let's look at what they are about and where their risks are right now, beside the environmental and climate risks, which I'll get to quickly. And the companies are also facing financial risks. Despite the high profits, their market was dysfunctional going into the pandemic. They were in an oversupplied situation from a period of overbuilding. There is a tremendous amount of competition, recycling, other kinds of potential feedstocks to change the way in which plastics are made. Investments could go there. You're seeing changes in trade patterns around the world, which makes the situation a little unstable. The Formosa plant you were talking about is hoping that it can export much of their product into China, and that is a very problematic proposition right now. So they're asking for tax breaks. I think you got 150 million, I think that's right, a year for the foreseeable future for this plant. And the community has come out, pointed out all the toxics issues. The Army Corps has said, the Army Corps of Engineers said, we have to look at this again. A local judge, when looking at the environmental justice issue, basically singled out this project as an iconic example of environmental racism. And so you look at it from a point of view of a community and as an investor, and you say these cumulative set of risks do not make for a good future partner. And if they know anything about the Louisiana tax exemption programs, the jobs claims have not delivered from everything that I can see. And I'm just beginning an examination of that right now. And so you have to, from that holistic point of view, you have to come to the conclusions, wait a minute, this is probably not the next best thing for us to be investing in. And we have to look at other areas of the economy that are expanding and figure out a way that we can do this, because we've already taken our fair share, more than our fair share of the toxic byproducts of this particular industry. And I think that's really what we're looking at. The partnership here is it's imbalanced. It's in favor of the companies and not producing the kinds of benefits that the corporation, that the communities need. And so you have that, you have a conflict and you have an imbalance. And you know what Brendan was just talking about from a bond perspective and from an investment perspective is quite insightful, and not many. And I applaud Moody's for raising these issues, including pointing out the dysfunctional aspects of our economy when it allows racism, when it allows inequality to fester. It plays out in the communities. It doesn't play out in the abstract. It plays out in communities. And we have to do something about it as we're thinking about it. And that question that Gabriel pointed out is a political question, which is, do we want to use public monies in these ways when we have the problems that we have? They maybe were contributors one time to some solutions, but right now in the context of many of the communities, they're not a plus, they're a minus. And even in their own industry, the profits may be high now, but those profits are very vulnerable. And you don't want in your community a company here one day, out the next. Shell closed down recently, for instance, in Louisiana, after many years. Other ones, Sasol is experiencing a shareholder fight because their profits aren't as high as they should be. So you have a much more complicated picture. And one, when you pile on the environmental and the climate risks, it just isn't worth it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. So we're close to the end of our presentation today. So I'd like each of the panelists to provide, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, and with noting the time, so we then close the day. Brendan, can we start with you and then go to Jane and Alice, please?
Sure. I'll try and do it in a minute if I can. I think for us, the question of value and measurement is a really important one, and it's from an environment perspective, and this is probably going to be a controversial thing to say, and I'll get internal phone calls when I say it. I think environmental risks have been easier to calculate and to measure historically than social risk has. You can calculate the damage that a hurricane does, or the time that a facility is without power. You can, to some degree, model the cost of sea level rise, depending on what model you believe in. What's a lot more difficult to do, and to some of the points that Alice and Jane were talking about, is modeling that social risk of not being able to fund healthcare or schools or other programs because the monies are either being diverted to or given up by local communities, right? So Moody's put out a 34-page document back in June on how we actually measure that. And we have made an attempt, and we've been very transparent. If you're really bored one day, you can actually go on and go through the appendices of that, which there's hundreds of pages that go line by line on how we measure individual risks in individual sectors. And we aren't trying to put dollar values on them. What we're doing is highlighting increased risk. And feedstocks was one that we highlighted for specialty chemicals, and looking at the increased probability of default and the increased risk that both municipalities and companies face going forward around social risk. The real big challenge for that from the bond market perspective, which is what I'm limited to speaking to, right, is the timeline, right? We all know these things are going to be risks 10 years from now, 5 years from now. Sometimes they're happening right now. But trying to mesh that with how does that overplay with the financial risk of a company and a community now is very difficult. And I'll wrap up with what I think has been one of the most fascinating things for me, having been doing this for the last 20 years, and 4 of those years at Moody's, is a much greater understanding and ability to analyze the interconnectivity of social risk and environmental risk. I'll give one quick example, then I'll shut up. If you think about the wildfire risk in California, utilities have always, their equipment has always started fires, always, right? And if you think about the fatalities that we had a few years ago with the Camp Fire, right? That part of the world has always been set on fire by the electrical services that run through there, not on purpose, it's completely accidental, right? But 20 years ago, no one lived there. Right? It's been social forces that have contributed to people leaving some of the areas of the middle part of California, lack of access to affordable housing, lack of access to good schooling, and not being able to pay the taxes. They've moved into some of these areas, and that has now overlapped with an ongoing environmental risk that was occurring and led to massively increased loss of life and property. Right? And there's definitely been a lack of sophistication around understanding the interrelationship between some of the very complicated and important social trends and some of the environmental trends, and those things are smashing into each other all over the world. And we're making an attempt to try and identify financial risk, because that's what we do as a company. I mean, personally, yeah. I'm obviously very invested in a lot of the other risk as well, but from a Moody's perspective, we've done a lot of work on trying to measure that, and anyone who wants to have more information on that, I can share hundreds of pages of documents that'd be great, give you our perspective on that.
Yeah. If you can share those documents with me, then I'll be able to distribute to the audience. Yeah. So Alice, what are your closing thoughts?
I think if you actually seriously think about toxicity as a risk and health, then it is a major liability, a major risk. I mean, how can you put a price on life? And I think the environment social dichotomy doesn't quite capture that, and this history of denial on the part of toxic risks and and obfuscation of the science is part of the reason. Is actually, if you really think about toxic liability for killing people, but ultimately with products in the workplace and communities, even if this is difficult to measure, then that is, yeah, incalculable.
That's really true. Well,
I want to
go ahead, Jane.
Oh, I want to build on that to say that it's interesting to think about the way that we scope out value and measurement, because I don't separate human health from the environment. Our health depends on the environment. And so when we measure the environmental impact of specific things, there are key major pieces that are left out of that. Toxicity, as Alice has mentioned, but also air quality is not being effectively measured. So when we talk about, like, we don't have enough air monitors, they're not monitored enough. Yvette mentioned in the chat that companies are often self-reporting. We just don't actually have comprehensive environmental or toxicity understanding of how we are affecting the environment or how we are affecting toxicity, because we are not measuring it effectively. And I think it's important that companies incorporate that into their estimation of risk. And I'll close that thought by saying companies need to incorporate that into their estimation of risk. The people who live next to the Exxon plant, they know how bad the air is that day based on the way that it tastes and the way that it smells. And I think it's important that we ground ourselves in the fact that the racism that is embedded in how these facilities get built and monitored or not monitored is an environmental and social risk and detriment to everyone. And it is my understanding from my very quick learn up on bonds in the last couple of weeks that bonds are built and bought on the idea of long-term stable return, stable investment. And if you are building this infrastructure on the backs of communities that are increasingly organized, increasingly resistant, and increasingly getting their own funding for their own air monitors to be able to prove the data that Alice is talking about has been missing, that is not a safe long-term investment. And that is something that people need to be keeping in mind, because we are organized.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Alice. And most importantly, thank all of you for participating today. Please note you can always email me. I can put you in touch with all the participants today. Or if you want to meet with other people in the chat, just let me know. That's my role. Finally, I just wanted to make it clear that when you think about the plastics pollution crisis that we're in, it's not just plastics in the ocean. It's when plastics are produced, and it's the toxic chemicals that are produced during that production process that we as society need to learn to address, mitigate, disclose, and be transparent about. We need to be honest with ourselves, our communities, and our investors. Thank you very much from Planet Tracker, and I hope you have a nice climate week, and let's do the best we can to protect this beautiful blue marble that we call home. Thank you.